Number systems. We have different types of numbers in the world, and we can categorize or group them into different groups. So now you can agree with me to say that any number in the world, it falls under the group of numbers. So any number is a number. But now, all these numbers can be categorized into two groups. For example, we have real numbers, and then we also have non-real numbers. So now, when we talk about real numbers, we talk about numbers that when you put them in your calculator, they are defined. So they give you a certain value. So that will be real numbers. They are numbers that exist in a calculator. For example, these numbers can be whole numbers, for example, 1, -2, decimal numbers like 0.333, fractions 15/20. Those different types of numbers that exist in a calculator, we call them real numbers. So any number that you know exists in a calculator, that is your real number. But now, when we talk about non-real numbers, we talk about numbers that don't exist in a calculator. So now, this does not mean the non-real numbers don't exist in the world. These non-real numbers, we call them imaginary numbers. And these imaginary numbers, we use them when we do a chapter such as complex numbers when you are in varsity or in college. But for now, what you need to know is that non-real numbers are numbers that don't exist in your calculator. For example, if you punch them in your calculator, they will give you an error. So if you put now any number divided by 0, that is going to be undefined. So if you can take your calculator and punch, for example, 10/0, the calculator will give you an error. Or you can punch any number, for example, 50 divided by 0, that is going to be an error. So that means any number that is divided by 0 is going to be a non-real number. And then another type of non-real number is a number that is inside a square root and is a negative number. For example, a square root of -2, a square root of -1, a square root of any negative number, that will give you an error on your calculator. So now as soon as the number gives you an error, therefore that number is a non-real number. So we're going to stop here with non-real numbers, but we're going to continue to explain the real numbers. So now, real numbers can also be grouped into two categories, of which are rational numbers and irrational numbers. So now, what are rational numbers? So rational numbers are numbers that can be written as a ratio. So now, a ratio is the same thing as a fraction. So if you have any number, that can be written in a form of something over something. We call this a ratio, or we call it a fraction. So now, any number that can be written as a fraction will be a rational number. So we have different types of rational numbers. For example, we have a number like 0.25. 0.25 is a decimal number, but it is a rational number because when you put it in your calculator, you say 0.25, then you say equals to, that is going to give you 1/4. So do you see that this decimal number, it can also be written as a fraction. So that makes it to be a rational number. So now you can normally have a number that is written as a fraction, for example, 7/3. So automatically we know this is a fraction, therefore the number is a rational number. We can have, for example, whole numbers that are positive or negative, for example, -1. So this -1 here, it can be written as a fraction, because now we know that -1 divided by 1 is going to be the same thing as -1. So it means the -1 can be written as a fraction. So therefore, that is a rational number. So do you see that even the positive and negative whole numbers, they are considered to be rational numbers because they can be written as a fraction. Another way at which you can write this -1, you can say -2 divided by 2. That will also give you -1. So this clearly indicates that positive and negative whole numbers can also be rational numbers. That means they can be written as a fraction. So now, when we talk about irrational numbers are opposite of rational numbers. Remember, rational numbers are numbers that can be written as a fraction. So irrational numbers are numbers that cannot be written as a fraction. So now these numbers, they usually have a lot of numbers that don't even repeat after a comma. For example, you can get 0.5236, 0.333334. You see now, there is no specific pattern after a comma. So those numbers, we are going to refer to them as irrational numbers. So now, how do you see irrational numbers? If you put an irrational number in your calculator, it is just going to give you a number with decimal numbers. It cannot be written as a fraction. For example, we have special values such as pi. So if you punch pi in your calculator, you will see that pi is equivalent to what? To 3.14159265 for continuing like that up to infinity. So that is an irrational number. For example, you can also punch a square root of 2. So if you punch a square root of 2 in your calculator, you get what? 1.414, a lot of numbers after a comma that don't even make a repetition or any pattern. So those numbers cannot be written as a fraction. So we call them irrational numbers. So but now remember, we also said that there are decimal numbers that can be rational numbers. For example, if you put on your calculator 0.333333, maybe you put 9 threes, you will see that in your calculator, this will convert automatically to a fraction and become 1/3. So if a number has a repeating or a specific pattern after a decimal, therefore that number can be a rational number. But now you need to prove that in your calculator to check if it can be written as a fraction. If it can be written as a fraction, therefore that is an irrational number. So now we have to stop here with irrational numbers, and then we have to continue with rational numbers. So now rational numbers can also be grouped into two groups, of which we call them integers and fractions. So but now, what are integers? Remember that we said we have positive and negative whole numbers, of which they can be written as a fraction, and we consider them rational numbers. So when we talk about integers by definition is positive and negative whole numbers. So remember, whole numbers are numbers from 0, 1, 2, moving like that to infinity. But now we also have to include negative numbers when we talk about integers. So by definition, integers are negative and positive whole numbers. So that is why they fall under rational numbers, because we said integers can also be written as what? As fractions. So we have now the other group, which is called fractions. So now we have two types of fractions. Fractions can be written as decimals, but now we have one decimal that terminates. Okay? That means the numbers after a comma, they just stop after a particular number. So that is what? That is a terminating decimal. For example, if you have 0.25, this is a terminating decimal fraction, because now this number here, it terminates after what? After a comma. So it stops at a specific value. So now this number here, it can be written as a fraction. So remember, I said if you want to see how can this number be written as a fraction, you are just going to punch in your calculator 0.25, and therefore if you get the answer will automatically convert this to a fraction. So now a fraction that terminates after a decimal, that means that stops after a decimal, we call it a terminating fraction. But now we also have a different type of a fraction, which is called a recurring fraction. So now a recurring fraction simply means now you have a number that does not stop after a comma. So but now it has a specific pattern. For example, we looked at 0.333333, and this will repeat up to infinity. So now the way to represent this, we can just say this is 0.3, and then we put a dot. This dot means that the number is recurring. So now this is what we call a recurring decimal fraction. So now this recurring decimal fraction, it can be written as a fraction. For example, I said if you put that in your calculator, you say 0. And then you put enough threes so that they cover your whole screen. Therefore, that will convert to what? To be 1/3, which is a fraction. But now the type of fraction which is what? Is going to be a recurring fraction. So now that is where we're going to stop about the fractions. And then we're going to continue to talk about integers. So remember, integers are just positive and negative whole numbers. So now we also can divide integers into two groups, of which is called the natural numbers and whole numbers. So but now, what are natural numbers? Natural numbers are all the numbers that are whole numbers, but now they start from what? From 1. For example, if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, moving to infinity, that is going to be a natural number. So they usually call the natural numbers counting numbers. For example, when you count, you will start with what? 1, 2, 3, to move like that up to infinity. So but now whole numbers are the same thing as natural numbers, but now they include the 0. So now we're going to have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to infinity. So those are called the whole numbers. So whole numbers are natural numbers including the 0. But now natural numbers are whole numbers excluding the 0. So it's more or less the same thing. So now we can now also talk about what? So these natural numbers can be divided into two groups. And then these two groups can be called what? The prime numbers and composite numbers. So but now what are prime numbers? So prime numbers are all the numbers that are only divisible by 1 and themselves. So for example, if you look at the number 2, 3, 5, and 7, all these numbers, they are only divisible by themselves and 1 only. So if you look for the factors of 2 here, you will find the factors of 2 is just 1 and 2. And then the factors of 3 is 1 and 3. For 5, 1 and 5. For 7 is 1 and 7. There are no other factors. So if a number can only divide by 1 and itself, it is called a prime number. But now a composite number is a number that can be divisible by other numbers. For example, if you look at 4 here, 4 can be divided by 2 and it can also be divided by 4. So now as soon as you can represent a number with not only 1 in itself, therefore that number can be what? A composite number. For example, this 4 here can be represented as 2 multiplied by 2. But now a prime number cannot be represented by two numbers that multiplies. It is only what is only a number multiplied by 1. For example, if you look at 11 here, there's no way you can write 11 by any number multiplied by any number. It is always going to be 11 multiplied by 1. So that is a prime number. But now a composite number, it can be written as what? As a product of other numbers. For example, if you look at 6 here, 6 can be written as what? As 3 multiplied by 2. So this makes it to be a composite number. So that is all that we have in this video. If I can just recap off on what we have done. Remember, we said what? We said we have the bigger number group, which is called numbers, because all the numbers in the world, they will fall under numbers normally. But now numbers can be grouped into two groups, which are real numbers and non-real numbers. So non-real numbers are undefined numbers when you put in your calculator, but real numbers are defined numbers as you put them in your calculator. So we can also go down with the real numbers to say we have rational and irrational. So we said rational are numbers that can be written as a fraction. So therefore irrational are numbers that cannot be written as a fraction. We also said that rational numbers can be grouped into what? Into two numbers. For example, integers and fractions. And we said integers are positive and negative whole numbers. And then we also said we have fractions, and we have two types of fractions, of which is a decimal fractions that terminates, and the other one is recurring. So a terminating decimal fraction, it is also a fraction, and then a recurring decimal fraction, it is also a fraction. So after that, we said integers can be divided into two groups, which are natural numbers and whole numbers. So natural numbers are whole numbers, but we start with what? We're starting from 1. And then whole numbers are natural numbers, including the 0. And then we said that natural numbers can also be broken down into two numbers, which are called what? Prime numbers and composite numbers. So prime numbers is any number that can only divide by itself and 1 only. But now composite numbers are numbers that can divide by what? By other numbers, not 1 and itself only. So that is what we have learned in this video, and thank you very much.